And I'd like to welcome Dr. Dornfield to the stage.
Good morning. It's nice to see everybody on the last day of the conference. I know it gets a little tiring. You've had a long time together, but it sounds like it's been a great conference. I wasn't able to be here to participate in any of the sessions, but we've been working, our firm CFAR has been working with the National Center for a few years now on a number of governance projects in the courts, and it's been a great collaboration, and I've learned quite a lot about the work you do. And sort of opened up for me, an understanding of the courts as organizations, the importance of governance and sort of good organizational work in the courts. So it's been great collaboration, and we hope to do more together. What I'm going to talk about today is really thinking about culture through the lens of the idea of an unignorable moment, and I'll talk about what that is in a moment. But we work in a number of different sectors, a lot of sectors not dissimilar from the courts. We do a lot of work in healthcare, we work in higher education, large not-for-profits, and also on the corporate side in complex organizations. And we've really learned a lot, some of it through kind of hard knocks, about the difficulty of making cultural change in these kinds of organizations. We know change is hard. But it's critical, and to really understand your culture and understand how you can draw on your culture through these times of change is really important. Our backgrounds at the firm, and mine in particular, are sort of eclectic. So I'm trained as an anthropologist and came into organizational work a little bit later in life, and we have a kind of mix of people with sort of social science backgrounds, psychology backgrounds, mediation backgrounds, and folks more with kind of business training. So we kind of bring both the sort of business side to organizational work and the kind of cultural and organizational sensitivity. And I think that's partly why the collaboration with the National Center has been really good. You have this deep expertise in the courts and understanding how to improve courts, and we bring sort of our thinking together. So I'm going to share some of that thinking with you today and invite you to participate and talk with each other a little bit about this idea of an unignorable moment. So make sure this is, I'm not getting slide change here. Okay, whoops. All right, so briefly what we're going to cover is a discussion of what an unignorable moment is, how we think about that as a kind of metaphor for change, and we wrote a book about this a little more than a year ago and have been talking about the book. And it's a really interesting metaphor. As I talk to groups about unignorable moments, it taps into where organizations are, where people are around processes of change and trying to understand how to make the most of change and make the most of these moments. So we'll talk a bit about that. I'm going to ask you to share at your tables, and if you're sort of sitting by yourself, you might want to gravitate during that time, which will come up soon, to join some colleagues and chat a little bit about some unignorable moments that you might have gone through or might even be involved in right now. So we'll give you a little time to share those. We might ask you to share those out together if you're able to. And then really focus on ideas for using culture to get unstuck when you're in these difficult moments. So change often starts with an unignorable moment, and you certainly have, as a theme for this conference, have used the very large and very public moment we're in now about racial justice, the legal system, the policing system, a very complicated moment, and one that is fantastic that you're kind of tackling and really thinking your way through, given the importance of the legal system and dealing with these issues. But we sort of see these moments a lot in organizations, and one that I do find helpful to talk about is a moment that the Veterans Administration went through. About 2 years ago, it really bubbled up. And do people remember this in the news? Yeah. So the VA, a very important healthcare organization, the largest healthcare organization in this country, went through a very difficult moment when Starting in the VA in Phoenix, it became clear that there were very problematic procedures in place for getting people to see their doctors. While waiting months and months to see people, patients were getting sick and in a few cases dying from these waits. And this blew up into a national scandal, and it became clear that it wasn't just this one VA, that there was a systemic problem in the VA about service and patient care, et cetera. And I'm a real proponent of the VA. I've worked with that system a bit. I think it does really important things, but it was clear that there was some big organizational challenges that they had to tackle. Interesting, I don't know if people have followed this, the 2 years later, it's not clear that they've really made a lot of progress here. Now it's a very big, complex system, a political system, very big bureaucratic system to change, so very hard to change. But it's an interesting example of an unignorable moment, maybe in some ways, a bit of a negative example, because they have not really been able to adapt and make the kind of systemic change that they have to make. But let's think about, change from this perspective. So an unignorable moment, what do we kind of mean by that? It's really a kind of critical time in an organization's life when they're facing disruptive change, facing changes in the environment that they have to adapt to. And I think in most sectors now, we see that change of that kind of disruptive nature has really become pervasive. We've certainly seen it in healthcare, and the VA, I think, in some ways was trying to respond to very big changes in the healthcare system overall. We see it now in education as higher ed has had to adapt to some real changing pressures in financing and needs of the educational system. So throughout different sectors, there's been this kind of dramatic change happening. And when you see these moments, you often see that there's a clash between the way work had been done before and the needs of this changing environment. Okay, and this is this notion of a kind of profound cultural shift that has to happen. And the question is, can the organization adapt to the needs of the future to be successful? Okay, so this is the idea of an unignorable moment. And when organizations hit this, there seems to be two different ways they can go. They can get into a kind of paralysis. They can get stuck in that moment and not be able to kind of work their way through. It's possible the VA is kind of stuck in its unignorable moment, or there can be a real release of energy and possibility. And of course, we like to see the latter, and we like to help organizations think about how to come through these moments successfully and use those moments as a catalyst for change. And we'll talk about some ways that can happen. But just to get a little more specific about unignorable moments, what makes an unignorable moment? There are a few features, 4 features really, that we think about. One is that these moments tend to be public. Certainly the Veterans Administration's challenges were very public, on the front page of publications nationally for months and months. So clearly that was public. The issues of racial injustice now have become public. That's what makes them kind of unignorable. I think these issues have been there for many years, but as they become public through incidents like Ferguson and the ongoing news discussions about racial justice and systemic problems there, they've become public. But they don't necessarily have to be public in that sense. Unignorable moments inside an organization might be public in your community. You obviously have a court community of folks. People know what's going on in other courts. If you had a difficult moment, an unignorable moment, it might just be public in the community in which you work. It might be public in the local community you're in. So they're public in some sense. Okay, that's part of what makes them unignorable. Secondly, they're systemic. Okay, these are not individual moments. These are moments in which the system itself is called into question. Okay, it's not about one person's performance. In the VA system, it wasn't just what was happening in Phoenix. What became clear was that this was a more national problem as this bubbled up. So it's unignorable as well because it's a systemic problem that has to be addressed more broadly. And there are strategies that might be local, but the problem is systemic. It's irreversible. So when you see these moments, you can't really go back. The bell has been rung. You have to kind of think your way forward. You can't just pretend they didn't happen, but you have to kind of address them in some way. And they really challenge your identity, and I think this was very true with the Veterans Administration. What is its identity as a healthcare system, as a public healthcare system? How could it shift its identity? We see this in companies all the time when they've run into a strategic problem that they have to think their way through. Who are they? Who do they want to be? Is their past identity an identity that will be successful into the future? And how that relates to your work would be interesting to see, but we'll have some time to talk about that. So these are kind of fundamental questions that require a different approach to change. Okay, so that's the idea of the unignorable moment. What I'd like you to do now is, if you can talk with some colleagues, and again, if you're at a table by yourself, feel free to get up and join a colleague. Take a few minutes and talk with each other about an unignorable moment you've either been through yourself, maybe it's one that your organization is facing currently, maybe it's one that you see on the horizon, okay? And take a few minutes and share with one or two others at your table, or if you're a small group, talk together about the nature of this moment, how it fits any of these elements of being public, being systemic, being irreversible, and being about identity. And then we're going to ask a few people to share these moments, okay? So take a couple of minutes, talk with each other about your unignorable moments. All right, just take 30 seconds more. If you haven't had a chance to share yours, make sure you get yours in if you'd like to. Okay, so now we're going to ask a few people to share with us your unignorable moment. We know that they're not always easily shared, and if it's a confidential one, that's fine. But let's hear from a few tables, one or two of your moments, and we've got one up front here. Please, yeah.
Okay, so we all immediately thought of this moment, and that was, and I'm with Los Angeles Superior Court in California, and we went through budget issues, shocker, right? And had to close 7 courthouses. So we went down to 38 courthouses. And this severely impacted our employees, but it also impacted the public because especially we had a lot of ADA claims because individuals that were wanting to come to court now, you know, we're having issues with public transportation and so forth. And so this is still impacting our organization today, and there's still individuals that are just living with employees and then also the public as well.
Okay, great example. And unfortunately, you know, budgetary moments are often a driver of change, but I think, you know, the question, and we're going to come back to these, by the way, towards the end of the session and think a little bit about how you approach these moments, but it sounds like this was about, budget was the driver, but it was about a broader change and really how you can serve your mission given the kind of constraints and downsizing you had to do. Yeah, good. Another one, Patty, thank you, okay.
One of the examples we talked about is just earlier this week, there was a shooting in a courthouse in Michigan.
Okay.
Very public. You can't unring the bell. From a systemic standpoint, it calls into question the security measures that we have in our courthouses, not only in Michigan, but perhaps across the country.
Right.
And one of the debates that is going on now in many counties in Michigan is that question of courthouses being public buildings, and we may have funding units that are saying, we don't want these public buildings locked down. We want the public to be able to come in and do business and interact. And yet on the court side, even though there might be other public functions going on in the courthouse, we have real concerns about the security and the safety of our judges and our staff and people that are coming into the court. Yeah,
it's an unfortunate example, but an excellent example of how that moment not only sort of called into question and made you think about some operational issues around security, but really the public mission and identity of the organization, right? Because if public access is part of who you are, part of the mission, how do you navigate that given this kind of incident? A great example. Others, got mics on either side. It'd be great to get one or two more into the mix. Anybody else up front here, Patty? Thank you.
Obviously, being from Missouri and from a municipal court, the topics of the week are relevant, but there's several of my colleagues that were, well, that's not the way we did it, because there's a lot of change that has to happen, and they were very hesitant to continue with the change, and they're resistant, and it's like, it doesn't matter, the train's still going. You got to get on and go. It doesn't matter what the way we used to do it is, and probably wasn't always the right way to do it.
Right, yeah, that's a good one. We're going to come back to resistance in a moment. It's such a key part of change, and we have a particular way of thinking about it. But it's, yeah, I mean, it's part of any organization. And the question really is, you know, what do you do with that resistance? We'll get to that in a moment, but, you know, how does that bubble up as a moment that you have to deal with, and what do you do? I mean, is it a, you know, that's where you can kind of get stuck, which again, I'll talk about in a second. So good one. One other, I lost track of Scott. Yeah? Okay, great. He's way back there, yeah. Big room.
So in Texas, statistics are published usually by county and not down to the judge level. So in other words, you can tell what a court as a whole is doing, but you can't tell what a judge individually is doing. We had an attorney who made an open records request for the internal reports that I publish, well, not that I publish, but that I give to the judges for their own caseflow management purposes. And I had to give it to them, and it ended up published in the local newspaper. So that kind of drove a very lengthy discussion with my judges that we need to actually own this data. We can't just, hand out the drafts. We got to actually do some real work with it. So that's where we are right now with that.
Right. Very interesting. So something became public inadvertently, and the inside got exposed to the outside. And I think that's an interesting dynamic. When we were finishing the book, we were looking for folks to, write reviews and so on. And we got contacted by a group, an association of PR executives. And they said, yeah, we'd like to, talk with you about the book and figure out how, in PR we really like to figure out how to kind of hide these moments and so on. And we said, well, that's not really the idea. It's actually, usually they can't be hidden, but even so, if the moment has happened, the PR response might be, how do we kind of smooth over this as quickly as possible, when in fact, what we would say is this is an opportunity to not rush past this, as I'll talk about in a minute, and think about really how do you deal with what might be a systemic issue that has to be talked about. Okay, those are great. Thank you, those of you who were brave enough in this big room to share. Again, we'll come back to these later on and hopefully allow you to do some good thinking about how to problem solve in these moments. So I want to step back now and talk about change and the kind of change we see happening. And I sort of mentioned the notion of disruptive change. It's kind of a bit of a buzzword in organizational circles right now. But we do think there's, pretty important systemic change happening in our work lives kind of across the board. And if you think about kind of, what the old world of work was like versus the new world of work or the emerging world of work, I think there's some really important differences. And I'm curious how these are showing up in your work. I've got a little bit of a sense from my work with the National Center. But, if you think about the old world of work, we might be talking about the 50s, 60s, but really has, still organizations operate in this way. On the left side, they were, the idea was that, organizations were fairly vertically structured. There was authority in place that people listened to, and that if given a task, people would do it. There was a kind of command and control sort of ethos in the workplace. You think about big companies. I just read a great business book about IBM and the big changes that happened in IBM in the 90s. And you sort of think about, some of the larger, sort of iconic corporations as being very hierarchical, very management focused. And motivation really came from above or came from outside, and people tended to be pretty obedient to those requests or demands on them. But the world of work is changing now, and I think in today's economy, particularly as generational change has happened, but even as organizations have learned that you can tell people what to do, but actually that doesn't necessarily get the best out of people. That people, if they are just compliant and obedient, are not going to do their best work. And there's been a kind of flattening of organizations, and I think for good reason, and a wish to really push authority down and out, to distribute authority so that people feel motivated themselves. They can make decisions, they can drive their own work. There's a lot of writing now about innovation and how to be innovative, you need to give people the ability to shape their own projects, to work in more kind of emergent ad hoc teams, to take on tasks and sort of drive them themselves. So this is an important shift that's happened in the workplace, and in terms of how people work and what really motivates them in this kind of emerging reality of the 21st century organization. And you could see this in the startup culture, you can see it in the Silicon Valley culture, but it's really beginning to pervade, I think, organizations more broadly. But these changes are not easy, right? They create a kind of sense of turbulence and a sense of change, and I think in many sectors, as I mentioned earlier, there's a sense that change is happening pretty quickly, and the pace is hard to keep up with. There's a sense of turbulence, a sense of really having to manage what's a kind of disruptive way of working. And, the courts, I'm not sure where you guys are along that curve. You might be a little bit, not as, not as far along as, say, startups and the kind of, tech culture, but I think that change is coming. You see it in technology, you see it in the way that, people want different patterns of work. They want to work from home more, they want to, have a little more control over their schedule, they want to bring technology of their own into the workplace. So these changes are happening, and they're disruptive. They change the way we work together. And in these disruptive changes, we can get stuck, right? We can reach these moments, as a few of you have mentioned, where the organization feels stuck around change. You feel that resistance. You can't move forward. You want to move forward, but it's hard to, and there's a sense of being stuck. So stuck tends to be seen as kind of a bad thing, right? Because nobody likes to be stuck. It tends to be a bad place to be. It's where you feel the tensions coming together. But so what do organizations do? They often try to rush past being stuck and try to figure out how to, quickly get unstuck, or to avoid it and to, sort of take that resistance or that, public sense of change and tuck it under the rug, okay? So that's a natural response, and one that many organizations will try. But we like to think about whether this moment of being stuck can be really seen as an opportunity for change, as a way to rethink your organization and come out more effective, more efficient, and more able to kind of meet your mission. So if you can think about this moment of being stuck as a time of potential learning, a time to build your capabilities, to develop the organization in new ways, you can really set the stage for change and realize that, in today's world of work, you're going to get stuck and you're going to have to get unstuck as conditions of work change. So can getting unstuck become a capability? So the kind of learning element, the ability to think your way through these kinds of issues, can be sort of seen as an organizational capability that might help you down the line. So how do you do that? How do you leverage the power of being stuck and think about ways to change? And we have 4 ideas that I'm going to talk about today that are some strategies that we've found to be effective working with organizations. The first is the idea of listening in, pausing and listening in, using resistance as a source of feedback in change. Third is kind of looking inside the organization for elements of the culture that you could build on for the future. And then the last one is thinking about building a coalition for change in your organization. So I'll touch on each of these for a few minutes. So listening in, what does that involve? And this is where, we sort of think about background as an anthropologist, our social science work. But in general, it's not a complex approach, but it's one that organizations don't naturally go to. Okay, and Patty and I were chatting earlier about, in the legal profession, I think you guys are well trained. Lawyers in particular are, have a lot of expertise. They've been trained to have answers. We work a lot with doctors. Doctors are very similar. They're very smart people. They've been rewarded for being smart. They've had to be smart to get to where they are. But sometimes that training and that sense of having the answers makes it hard to listen to others, right? Because you're the one who is supposed to have solutions, and you rush to solutions too often. So how do you listen into an organization, your own organization, other organizations, to really understand the behaviors that are going on, the dynamics of the organization that are holding people back, but kind of most importantly, to see these dynamics through the lens of the other. That's where the power of listening in comes. We all know our own point of view very easily, but how do you kind of see what's happening at the front line, see what's happening in another part of your organization? And this idea of listening in can be really helpful. And, this is sort of the skill of an observer, but also, collecting information, talking to others in a purposeful, structured way to really listen, to understand what's going on from their perspective, ask questions, sort of understand the signals of change that are happening from their point of view. It takes practice. It's not necessarily easy, but instead of jumping to causes, you really want to hear what's happening. Be prepared to be surprised, because you often find that when you listen into the organization, you listen into other people's points of view, you learn things that you might not have known, okay? And that openness is, again, a kind of skill, the kind of holding back judgment to hear from others, to really understand what's happening from their point of view. Using feelings as data is a kind of interesting one. We know that sometimes you have a kind of emotional reaction to the change that's happening, or an emotional reaction to what's going on, and that emotional intuition is not to be ignored. If something's making you uncomfortable, if you feel tension around change, there's probably a reason for that, and you want to understand what's making people feel uncomfortable, so you really understand, not necessarily that they're right or wrong, but just use that as data as you're trying to capture the context for what's happening. Many points of view, there's no one right version in these moments of difficulty, these moments of tension, but to really understand multiple sources. So, an example of this for us was we were working in a healthcare system with the nursing units in this system, and this system, very cutting-edge academic medical center, was trying to really change the nature of care at the bedside and really think about new models of care. Those of you who follow what's happening in healthcare, there's been a real push towards more integrated care, team-based care, so it's not just the doctor, the surgeon, et cetera, delivering the care, but it's a team of nurses, nurse practitioners, doctors, et cetera, people from different roles delivering that care, and that's a big change of practice on the ground. So we worked with a couple of the nursing units, and they were interested in these two roles, a clinical nurse manager and a nurse specialist. And what we did was we actually taught them in a very kind of on-the-ground way to be observers. Okay, we kind of trained them as anthropologists, and over a course of 6-8 weeks, they went out and did observations. They interviewed people. They took photographs with their cameras, their phone cameras, of what was going on. Not of people in their role, but people in the role they wanted to understand. So we paired them up, and they shadowed each other, did these observations over the course of a couple of months, and it was amazing what they found. It was very insightful for them to understand their counterparts in the organization, what their challenges were, what they worried about, to talk to those folks, and then to even observe people in their own role. So it allowed them to kind of pause, to see the work in a different way. And they came back with insights about collaboration, about handoffs of patients from one to the other, about how to work with doctors better, about how to use technology, about how the space was configured, a lot of insight. Now, I'm not saying everybody has the time to kind of turn into anthropologists, but if you take that kind of observational mode in mind and you listen to others, and talk to others, sit down with colleagues, ask them what are they struggling through, do a focus group with a group of colleagues to pose some questions and see what's on their minds. And I think my understanding is that the project that you've got going with Tavis Smiley is very much in this vein. You're going out, you're listening to others around these issues of racial injustice and the legal system. That to me is a great example of kind of listening in. So again, we don't often take the time in these moments of stress to stop, to listen, and to understand. Okay, so that's one kind of core skill that we think and an approach that works. The second idea about moving towards resistance, the gentleman who talked about facing resistance and change, we know that resistance is always part of change. It's not something to get around as you're working through change, it's actually embedded in change. Whenever there's change, there's resistance. We feel this ourselves. If you have to move your office, if you have to use a new piece of technology, you always feel resistant, and for good reason. You've got a routine, you're productive in it, and change always feels like a drag on that productivity. But what we've learned is instead of kind of shying away from resistance or steering around it, which a lot of change methodologies might suggest, don't worry about those people, they'll come on board. You actually, if you embrace resistance as a source of feedback and learning, it can be very powerful and can give you a lot of insights. Why are people resistant? What is it that they're struggling with? We did some work a couple of years ago, a very sort of complicated project around leadership change in a professional services firm, a large firm, and they were going through a leadership change according to their bylaws. But there was a group inside that was very unhappy, a group of shareholders, principals who were very unhappy. And they really formed a resistance group. They kind of advertised themselves as the activist group. They talked about wanting to blow up the organization. They were going to take over the board well before this process was moving too slowly for them. And they, as we met them and started to talk to people, it was very clear who they were and what their agenda was. So it was a clear force of resistance. And the question was, how do you deal with them? How does the leadership deal with them? The leadership was considering firing these folks. They had grounds to fire them. They thought, let's just get rid of them. We'll be fine without them. But we actually counseled them to not do that. We sat down with the resistant group, tried to really understand what their concerns were. The leadership didn't always agree. They didn't always agree with our point of view. But we were able to at least listen to them, hear where what the source of their worry was, and it was really, in the end, a business worry. They were worried about the success of the company. And they had some really valid concerns. And by talking to them and really understanding why they were resistant, and also by them feeling heard, they agreed to kind of put off their what they call the nuclear option in this organization and stay with the process and go through a leadership change process that wound up being fairly constructive for them. So using resistance as a source of information and not running away from it, but working with it is another strategy in change that we think of. And part of this is the difference between push and pull, okay? Again, a kind of dynamic of change. Organizations are always pushing things on people, right? That's sort of the nature of organizational change. There's a new program, there's a new technology, there's a new system that you have to comply with. And we know overall that getting stuff pushed at you is not very motivating, right? We all get tired of all the emails, we get tired of the meetings, et cetera. It's not a great way to change. So how can you shift from push to pull? How can you create opportunities for people to get involved in ways that feel inviting to them, that tap into their energy, tap into their passions, tap into their interests? So sometimes you have to rethink a little bit your program to think about how is this going to affect somebody in a different part of the organization. What will they get out of it, right? How to appeal to their interests. So the flip from push to pull, so people see these change processes as an opportunity to improve their work, to get more done, to take burdens off of them. That's another important dynamic of this kind of resistance. All right, so that's the second area. And then third is this idea of finding the future inside. And this is an important part of how we think about change. It's a little counterintuitive. Usually when organizations are going through change, their natural inclination is to look outside. Okay, we're kind of stuck. We're not doing things well, whatever the issue is. Let's look at other entities, other court systems, other industries, et cetera. And that's good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it can be quite helpful. But we find that actually if you flip that and look for sources of innovation inside your organization, that can be very powerful too. And there's a great quote by this science fiction writer, William Gibson. I don't know if people know his work, but he has this wonderful quote that the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. The idea here is that in any organization, there's always pockets of innovation going on. They could be, in places that are not visible, that you don't necessarily see them, but it might be one group within the organization that's tried some new practices or reorganized the way that they do their meetings or have created a new way to use technology. And these are little pockets of change that are happening. We call them found pilots. And the reason we call them found pilots is that they're found, okay? You discover them in your organization. They're existing, and the work is to kind of find them. And they're pilots in the sense that they're elements of the future. They're experiments towards moving to a new future, but they're not fully fleshed out. They're not fully visible. They're not, accepted practices, but they're behaviors that you could learn from. And a good example of this, we had been doing some work, again, at a university a number of years ago that was struggling with helping students with technology. Okay, their computer services process was kind of stuck. They knew that people, this was when people were really starting to bring laptops into the dorms and work very sort of virtually. And they knew that people needed help, but they didn't know how to help them. They had a centralized computer service system. People didn't want to bother with that. They didn't want to come in, to the main center. They were working late at night, as students do, and they needed help then. So what they found was that when they looked around in terms of where change was happening, they actually found that in a lot of the dorms, there were a couple of young kids who were very tech savvy, who were actually going around helping people anyway, right? You all know that friend who can help you with your technology problem. Well, the dorms had plenty of these kids around. They weren't, formally part of the system, but they realized that instead of trying to create a help system that would get at that problem, there was a solution already out there. They just had to figure out how to tap into it. So what they did was they found some of these kids and they experimented with putting them on the payroll so that a couple hours a night they would be the tech service folks, the computer service folks, and be connected to the central service system, so they knew what software to use and they knew how to get people on the network, et cetera. But they became a kind of found pilot for a more distributed approach to service. So this is an idea of using what's already existing in the culture as the seed for change, and not trying to replace your culture, although sometimes you do need wholesale change. Usually finding these innovations and figuring out how to work with them can be a great way to make change happen. It's very hard to change by bringing in an external process, but if you can find innovation that's already been kind of blessed by your culture, that's grown up in your culture, it's much more likely to be successful as you try to make change happen. Okay, so this is this idea of found pilots. Now, when we think about these, and we often work with organizations to look for their found pilots, to go out there and talk to people, see where these areas of innovation are happening, you have to realize they're never perfect. They're fragments. They're kind of building blocks of the future. They're not complete models. They're not, fully ready to go. But they're often ways to start innovation, and then your work becomes kind of building on them and trying to give them more resources, give them more visibility, connect them with each other. And then lastly, what you do through this work is you begin to build a coalition for change. And this is the fourth idea that I want to leave you with, is that when change happens, you need help, right? You can't do this alone. And you need folks to help you. You need a kind of village to make change happen, right? And there are formal ways to do this, of course, but we find that sometimes just thinking about the kind of coalition you need is really important. So what are good people to help you with change? Obviously, people with passion are very helpful, people who really care about the change you want to see happen. And rather than spending a lot of time on folks who are resistant right up front, think about who are a few people who could provide energy for your change, who really care about it and are motivated to help. Secondly, some skeptics, and this is again a little kind of counterintuitive, but if there are people who can give you a kind of skeptical point of view, we talk about the skeptical friend often. So somebody who is honest, is a good thinker, might be that person who's a little contrarian, might not always be agreeable, but if they care enough to give you some feedback and to help you think about the change you want to have happen and redirect it, that's a really important person to have in your coalition. And then lastly, people with good networks in the organization. And if you think about the idea of an organizational network, and there's great work now on studying how networks work in organizations, who are the people who are connected across the organization, people who can bridge you to other parts of the organization. And these are not, this is not based on the formal organizational structure, but I think if you thought about it, and you might be those connectors yourselves, there are always some people in an organization who know others, who can, tap you into somebody in finance or somebody in administration or technology, and have a kind of, an ability to move across parts of the organization, to cut across those silos and figure out ways to be helpful, okay? So these are some of the kind of skill sets you need in a coalition for change. And then we like to think about sort of building this stakeholder group in a systematic way. And if you think about who the stakeholders are around a change effort, and how they are positioned in your effort, you can do some very simple, what we call stakeholder mapping, okay? So for instance, you just can use a simple 2x2, which consultants really like, and think about, what's their level of power in the organization, and how are they aligned in relation to the change you want to see happen? Are they for it? Are they against it? And you think about different strategies for different people in these positions. So if somebody's very powerful and they're in favor of your organization, obviously you want to link to them. You want to build those people in favor of your change. You want to build them into your change process. That's pretty straightforward. If they're powerful and against your change, for whatever reason, how do you deal with those kinds of stakeholders? Well, you don't want to ignore them because they're powerful, they matter, they have influence in the organization, but you have to deal with them, thoughtfully and carefully. So you might want to listen to them, see what the source of their resistance is, figure out how you can link to their interests, because often you'll have interests in common with them. Sometimes you have differences as well, but if you can link to and understand their interests, you're more likely to get them on board. And then if you can reframe your effort in ways that build in their interests, well, that's great, because then you could get them really on board with the change you want to see happen. So that's a really important stakeholder group. If they're less powerful and in favor of you, you can connect with them, keep them informed. You might not want to spend a lot of time with them, but they're an important group. And then those who are less powerful and against your effort, these are people who you might want to convert if possible, but prepare to manage them down the road. But in your early stages, you wouldn't want to spend a lot of time with them. They're not critical stakeholders. So if you think strategically, and we often have groups do this, and it can be very productive if there's a task force working on a change process, you can do the stakeholder mapping, and there's a very simple tool that we use where you would list your stakeholders and then really map out what are their interests, what's their level of power, who influences them, who do they influence, so what's their sphere of influence, and what pull strategies can you use to kind of tap into their interests. So this is a very simple approach to thinking about stakeholders, but it's based on the idea that for any change process, you need to be strategic about how you're going to use the important people in the organization to mount that change, okay? So a few ideas, a few tools to work with. Let's, in the time we have left, let's spend about 7-8 minutes at your tables. Give them a little time to work first. So talk in your groups again, maybe pick one of the unignorable moments that got surfaced, and maybe think together, consult to each other, how would you use any of these processes? How could you listen in? How could you work with resistance? Okay? How could you see innovation happening inside the organization? And then who would be in a coalition for change, okay? So take a few minutes at your tables, maybe pick one of the ideas that were surfaced or in your small groups, and spend a little time applying these strategies, and then we'll hear from a few folks about what you were able to do, okay? Thank you. One more minute. Mics are coming around, so we hope a few people will share an insight. Scott and Patty have mics. So maybe just, as the time's getting tight, just one idea that came up at a table for how to apply any of these strategies in a change effort in an unignorable moment you're involved in. One insight. Anybody willing to share? Who came up with a strategy either for a past unignorable moment you had to navigate and a strategy you might have used, or maybe something you're involved in now? Okay, I think we've got one towards the back.
Hello, we're from, well, the table is from Arizona, actually, and what happened several years ago when the recession took place is that services for people who are on Access, which is the state-funded medical program for people in need, was severely cut, and where the cuts really manifested themselves were with people that were diagnosed as seriously mentally ill. And it took a lot of the programs away from them, one of which is being case managed by people to navigate them through services. The courts in Arizona, our court in particular, and other courts as well, had mental health court treatment dockets, and a very viable part of those dockets were the case managers appearing at those dockets on behalf of their clients to navigate them through the criminal justice system. With the decrease in that, a lot of these people that were in the dockets that previously had case managers or new ones coming in no longer had case managers, and case managers, as I stated, were a critical part of that. Listening in, what we did was listen to those people and what their needs were, the defense attorneys that had previously represented them in these cases, and listen to what the problem was. The resistance, of course, was the budgetary aspect of it. There was no way that we were going to be able to change the state's mind as far as funding is concerned with these situations. How we saw the future inside was within our own municipality. We had a social services organization that worked with the city with licensed social workers and licensed counselors. And what we did was able to build a coalition with them to get them to agree to take on these people and case manage them through the system.
Great. Yeah, that's really nice. So a number of elements there. And just on that last one, the sort of the finding the future piece, you know, it's often the case, and there's actually good writing in the innovation literature about this, that the innovation often happens out at the periphery. It's not necessarily in the central part of the organization, and that's actually okay. That's where, you know, people have a little more space and so on. And then and tapping into that sounds like a great strategy. You know, there's a lot of debate about then, do you bring those innovations into, how do you bring those innovations into a more mainstream kind of conversation without them getting sort of tamped down and the innovation being squeezed out of them. So that's a challenge, but I love that idea. Good.
Barry,
yes, Scott.
We do have one more over here.
Great.
Okay. I'm from Cleveland, from Domestic Relations Court, and in 2008, the Ohio Supreme Court, as a result of a lot of complaints about our court, came and did a performance review. They issued a report that was included 101 recommendations that one might consider scathing about the way our court processed its cases. And that information, of course, went to the papers, and they published numerous articles that were highly critical of our court. It resulted in a change in the administration, the administrative judge retiring, and new people coming on board. And we sat down and tried to figure out what we were going to do to work on this. And the thing that I'm very grateful about is that because of the Supreme Court's report, it forced us to reassess how we did things. Mm-hmm. And it also gave us a roadmap of what we had to do, because that was something that would have been very difficult to try to figure out, every step of the way. But we, the people there were very passionate about doing things right, and everybody rolled up their sleeves and tried to figure out what we were going to do, and there was a lot of discussion within the court, and we decided we were going to do things better. So we sort of systematically went about trying to make those changes that they had recommended. We decided that we were going to use our website to really communicate with the community, and even though it's not perfect, we are working on it every single day, and the culture is really one of improvement now. How can we do things better? I think the real problem that we had at our court was a problem of leadership from the top. It was probably lacking or almost non-existent because of people who had been in place for quite a long time. And what we found is that our greatest strength was our people, because they knew exactly what needed to be done, but they hadn't been given the permission to go forward and try to make change. And so when the leadership changed, our court was able to harness all that passion and energy that the people had to try to do things right, and to try to engage in the community and let people know that we really weren't this awful place, and that we actually really had very good statistics, but we didn't know how to toot our own horn. And so things are much better now, but that's our success story.
Great. That's a wonderful case. And I think you've hit on a lot of really interesting points. You know, that phrase that came up around the recession several years ago about never let a good crisis go to waste. You know, I think in some ways you've really hit that and you know, really figured out how to learn from that crisis and improve and use it as a time to take stock. I think the questions of leadership are really complicated, and it's obviously an important, critical part. But I do think, you know, and Mary, if I can point you out here, has written some really thoughtful pieces about, you know, sort of leadership in what we call loosely coupled systems. Courts are complicated systems, and yes, leadership from the top's critical. And I would say there are, you know, other ways. It's not the only piece of leadership. You know, there's also leadership in the middle, and I think, you know, in some ways, many of us are middles. I don't know if it's fair to say, you know, we have people above us, below us. How do you lead from the middle around these change processes? It sounds like your case actually exemplified that, as you had a change in leadership at the top. You know, there are ways to continue to make change happen in these kind of complex systems. So it's great story. Good. Well, I think we're just about out of time, so why don't we wrap up? You know, didn't have too much time for questions, but I'm around. I'm actually going to be doing a breakout session in 15 minutes that's going to go through some other tools and ways of thinking. You know, here's some references to the book, and please, I'm happy to chat with people by email if you'd like to touch base and talk more. So thank you. It's been great to talk with you. Yeah.